It's day 2 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoiler, and today, Kellan joins up, plus we get new versions of Marchesa and Riku and Bruse Tarl and a bunch more super sweet stuff. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Outlaws at Thunder Junction spoilers. So today, we have a lot of stuff to talk about. Thankfully, not quite as much as yesterday, which was one of the biggest spoiler days that I have ever seen. But we have some really spicy cards, a bunch of new legends, some really playable stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Outlaws of Thunder Junction cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Outlaws of Thunder Junction. First up today, we got a pretty good one, a new white bird rogue in Aven Interrupter. So a 3-mana 2/2, it has flying and flash. When it enters a battlefield, you exile a spell and it becomes plotted, so it can be cast on a future turn for free, except there's another ability. Spells your opponents cast from graveyards or from exile, like plotted cards for example, cost 2 more to cast. So Aven Interrupter, obviously this is not a hard counter. It's not going to stop your opponent's big thing forever, but it is a really solid tempo play, right? A 3-mana 2/2 flying flash body, a pretty reasonable rate. That's already like a decent card that can maybe ambush Viper, pressure your opponent, plus you're slowing your opponent down by disrupting their plays, making them plot their spell, make them play it in the future. It can be especially good at like disrupting combos. If your opponent's key card, they need that turn to like finish their combo, maybe just delaying it for a turn is going to be good enough. Plus you get the 2-mana attacks in the hate card mode. So if you want to look at comparisons, first thing I thought of when I saw Aven Interrupter was kind of a twist on Spell Queller. That's probably the closest comparison. Also kind of reminiscent of Elite Spellbinder a little bit. And the last mode is sort of like a friendly Drannith Magistrate. It's not like the hard lock of Drannith Magistrate, but still making your opponent's stuff from graveyards or exile cost 2 more to cast. That is pretty relevant in some matchups. So this is kind of like a reprieve effect. This is a tempo play. Just like reprieve isn't permanently going to answer your opponent's thing, it is a really good way to just disrupt your opponent, slow them down, and I think Aven Interrupter is going to have a lot of uses in that regard. Also, it is especially good at winning counter wars. This is probably the best target for Aven Interrupter, because remember the rules of plot are, you can only cast the plotted cards at sorcery speed, which means if you can Aven Interrupt a counter spell or a Force of Negation or a Force of Will, it essentially is a hard counter, because you're never going to be able to cast a counter spell at sorcery speed. So if you use this to win a counter war, it kind of wins the counter war forever. So that's one of the tricks of this card. And I think that last mode, the taxing things that are cast from graveyards or exile, is probably way more relevant than maybe you think at first glance. So think about standard right now. We have adventures, which are cast from exile. We have the discover mechanic, which is casting things from exile. So Aven Interrupter really slows both of those things down. Sure, your opponent's still going to be able to cast their questing druid, but it's going to be 4 mana rather than 2 mana. Or they're still going to be able to like Quintorius Con discover, but it's not going to be free. There's going to be attack, so they can't just play Quintorius Con and immediately discover 4. So that's a pretty nice ability there. Plus it hates on like Impulse Draw, of course, any reckless impulse effects. And once you get back to older formats, it just kind of locks down Underworld Breach combo kills. You're not going to be able to combo off with Underworld Breach, casting stuff from your graveyard if there's a 2-mana attacks on everything. It shuts down stuff like Crashing Footfalls doubly. You can't cascade into the Crashing Footfalls, and you can't suspend cards because they're being cast from exile. And I think the most obvious thing is it's designed to be a hate card against the plot mechanic. So if plot becomes a thing in standard, this goes up in value even more. So I think this card could just see play as a generic card. I could see some sort of like tax deck developing in standard. We got Thalia still, we got Tishana's Tidebinder, we got Aven Interrupter. Maybe you just play all these like disruptive, flashy creatures and kind of just annoy your opponent out of the game. Also seems interesting in Timeless. So in Timeless right now, Show and Tell is the best deck in the meta. That deck is so strong. And I think one of the best answers to the Show and Tell deck is actually Taxes decks. And I think that Aven Interrupter could be a nice addition to a mono white or an Azorius tax deck, a Boros tax deck in Timeless. And I could even see this maybe showing up in Modern in like Aether Vial Death and Taxes decks. So all around, Aven Interrupter it's just a really solid disruptive card. We've seen somewhat similar cards in the past. This is like the Outlaws of Thunder Junction twist on it, but all around, I expect this card will definitely see standard play and has a chance to show up in some older formats as well. We also got Step Between Worlds. Speaking of plotting, so Step Between Worlds, 5 mana sorcery, says each player may shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library. Each player who does draws 7 cards, then you exile it and you can plot it for 6 mana. So Step Between Worlds, wow, I'm really torn on this card. So on one hand, this kind of reminds me of Time Spiral. If you've ever seen like High Tide combo go off, where they're like casting all these spells and you eventually tap all your lands and then you Time Spiral and untap all your lands and then keep comboing off with a new handful of cards, Step Between Worlds can kind of do this. The only problem is it's got Suspend 1, right? So you have to cast the Step Between Worlds and then wait a turn and then try to combo off in a future turn once it's free. But this is a draw 7 that can be free during your combo turn if you plot it in pay 6 to get it set up. So I could see uses there. I don't know if this is going to be fast enough. Like I said, like part of what makes Time Spiral and High Tide combos work is you can just chain cards together. Like your mid combo, you cast your Time Spiral and you're trusting you're going to draw another Time Spiral. Step Between Worlds isn't going to really work there. Like I guess you can just cast it for 5 mana, but still you're not going to get that free effect that you get out of something like Time Spiral. But I could see this supporting some sort of Storm style combo deck, assuming it's fast enough. It is very awkward that they worded it that your opponents don't have to wheel if they don't want to. I'm assuming this is like a shout out to Shieldrids and Orcish Bowmasters and Narfsets, so you can't really use this offensively. We've seen decks in various formats that are trying to like Orcish Bowmasters wheel your opponent, Narset wheel your opponent. Step Between Worlds literally can't do that, because if it's going to be a negative for your opponent to shuffle their hand and graveyard in and draw 7 cards, they'll just choose not to do it. They have the option not to do it. I'm actually not sure how I feel about that overall. Like, obviously, I'm not a big fan of getting Narset wheeled or like Bowmaster wheeled. It's annoying when it happens, but I also don't know if I want Wizards to like remove these downsides from the game. One of the things I worry about with Magic is it feels like Wizards recently has like went really far to take any potential downsides out of cards, and I wonder if this is like a little bit too much. Like, I don't know, if you're gonna combo off with a Shoulder in a Step Between Worlds, maybe that's fine and you just gotta like stop it and get good or whatever. So I don't know if I like that it's optional, but whatever, I can see why they did it. As far as how you use this card, like I said, I think the main plan would be to plot it and then set up your big combo turn where you're going to storm off and win with Great Shop or Tendrils or whatever big storm finisher you have. Could also maybe see an argument for trying to do it with prowess creatures, where you like get a couple of prowess creatures on the board, get this plotted, and then set up for the prowess combo kill where you're going to like dump your hand and cast all your spells, refuel with Step Between Worlds, make your prowess creatures huge. Of course, the issue with both of these plans is paying 6 mana and leaving Step Between Worlds face up in exiles. Your opponent sees it coming. That's a lot. That's a lot of mana, and you're pretty much saying like, I'm going to kill you next turn, opponent. Like, either answer my Step Between Worlds or answer me, or you're probably going to die. So that's kind of the drawback of it. Although there could be a world where Step Between Worlds and these plot cards being face up in exile and your opponent knowing that they're going to be coming for free in the future could maybe be an upside. I don't know if you could do some mind games with your opponent where you like plot a Step Between Worlds and your opponent's going to be like, oh no, they're going to wheel away my hand. I want to take advantage of this. So I'm going to dump my hand so I can take advantage of this option to draw 7 cards. So your opponent just like dumps their hand and then you're like, haha, Sunfall you, Wrath your board. And I just won't cast my Step Between Worlds. So enjoy being empty-handed and not having any creatures on the battlefield. So Step Between Worlds, it's an interesting card. My guess is it's probably not quite good enough, although if you squint hard enough, you can kind of see Time Spiral at home, and Time Spiral's a pretty busted card, so maybe there will be some combo deck that can make it work. We also got a new Bruse Tarl in Bruse Tarl Roving Rancher. So a 4-mana Boros 4/3 legendary human warrior. It gives Oxen Weak Control double strike, and whenever it ETBs or attacks, we exile the top card of our library. If it's a land, we make a 2/2 white X creature token. Otherwise, we can cast it until the end of our next turn. So Bruse Tarl, it kind of reads like a meme, right? It cares about Oxen, not one of the most powerful creature types in Magic or popular creature types in Magic, but I think this card's actually kind of legit. If you think about what it is, it's a 4-drop that when it ETBs essentially makes a Raging Bull. I guess it's a white Raging Bull, but still it makes a Raging Bull, except it's going to have double strike. So if you hit a land, it's going to give you a 4/3 Bruse Tarl and essentially 4 more power with this double striking Ox. That's a 4-drop that adds 2 bodies and 8 power and toughness to the battlefield. That's already pretty good. Or if you don't hit a land, you essentially ETB, draw a card. It's impulse draw, but you get to play it until the end of your next turn. So it's like an improved Abbot of Carol Keep because you get that extra turn to play it, which is actually huge for this card because you want to be able to tap out for this on turn 4. But there's a pretty high risk that you're going to hit a non-land card, and if you couldn't cast it until the end of your next turn, it would just go to waste. But you don't have to worry about that with Bruse Tarl. So obviously, if you want to build an Ox Tribal commander deck, Bruse Tarl, it's going to be your commander. We don't have an Ox Tribal commander. The bad news is there's like less than 20 Oxen in Magic, and honestly, most of them are just downright bad. I think there's 2 rares or mythics, Liberated Livestock and Ox of Agonis, and after that you're down to like Battered Cows and Giant Oxen and just not very strong cards. So can you do it? Yes. Should you do it? Well, probably also yes, but not if you're trying to win. If you're trying to have fun and play Oxen, yes, go for it. But I don't think you're going to make a super strong Bruse Tarl Oxen deck at this point. Maybe we get some more Oxen in Thunder Junction itself. Obviously, you can kind of cheat on this. Changelings, Maskwood Nexus. I'm actually curious if Tomer would play this in his, like, Dragon Changeling deck. Is this good enough if you're playing a bunch of Changelings, giving your entire team double strike and maybe drawing some cards? I don't know if that's actually good enough, but maybe. So, all this to say, it's a funny commander. I'm probably going to build around it because it's hilarious, but I don't expect it to be a super strong commander. On the other hand, I don't think it has to be. This is just like a good card for a format like Standard. I think the most obvious home is something like the Boros Exile deck, where you have these payoffs for casting cards from Exile, right? You got Contorious Con to burn your opponent a bit. You got PNLR to make Thopters. You're already playing all these Ren's Resolve and all these impulse draw effects. Bruse Tarl seems like just an easy inclusion there. It's legendary, so maybe you're playing a couple of them rather than a playset. But still, it comes down. Worst case, you hit an Ox and you make a ton of power. Best case, you impulse draw and cast the card and trigger your PNLR, trigger your Contorious Con. So I actually think this is just a reasonable threat. It adds a lot of power and toughness. It generates card advantage. It's just like a good card. And it's wild to me just like how strong Magic cards are now. Like this, I would say, is one of the least exciting cards from the set as far as like power level or whatever. It feels kind of like, you know, a gimmicky intro pack card. And even this card, its power and toughness is good, its ability is good, it attack triggers, it ETB triggers, it does everything you want to do out of like a constructed playable card. So we're at the point now where even our bad cards are pretty good, which I guess is a pretty good place to be. Next up, we got Roxanne, Starfall Savant, a 5-mana 4/3 legendary cat druid. When it enters a battlefield or attacks, you create a tapped colorless artifact token named Meteorite with, when it enters a battlefield, you deal 2 damage to any target and it taps to add a mana of any color. And then when you tap an artifact token for mana, add 1 mana of any type that artifact can produce. So this card is actually very intriguing to me. I'm not sure how good this card is, but the fact that this is a 5-drop that essentially makes a 5-drop, not a good 5-drop, but it does make a 5-drop with its ETB trigger, and when it attacks, that actually is kind of interesting, right? You're getting a 5-mana 4/3, which isn't great stats, but then you're also getting 2 damage to something and a mana for the future once your Meteorite becomes untapped, and it's going to keep doing this every time it attacks or if you blink it or something. And even better, your Meteorites or any other artifact tokens are going to tap for extra mana, so your Meteorites tap for 2 instead of 1 as long as Roxanne is out. So there could be some uses here. Like, I can kind of see the comparison to Inferno Titan in a weird way. Like, you play Inferno Titan, you get 3 damage, right? You play this for 1 less mana, you get 2 damage, and you're making some mana, which kind of also makes it a little bit like Savella, the Ice Shaper or something. So I think if you add all this together, there's a lot of good things going on here. I don't know where it fits exactly. I'm not sure what like Standard deck would want it. Probably too expensive for sure for like Modern or Pioneer, but it does offer a lot of value. It's got a good ETB, got a good attack trigger, can do a bunch of ramping. The other thing worth mentioning about this card is it works with any artifact token that makes mana. So So, of course, it makes the meteorites itself, but this mostly means that your treasure tokens are going to make 2 mana instead of 1 mana, because you do have to tap treasure tokens to sack them and make the mana. So this is going to make all your treasure tokens tap for 2. Also, probably pretty good in Kibo Utabi Prince, which makes a bunch of bananas that you can sacrifice for mana. So easy inclusion there as well. But I can imagine Roxanne actually being legitimately scary in a deck that can make a bunch of treasures, because tapping your treasures for 2 instead of 1, like we've seen it with Goldspan Dragon, is a really, really strong effect. So I think that Roxanne, at a minimum, is a fun build around for Commander. I could see it showing up in Standard. Like, this is a reasonable ramp effect. We see like Archangel of Wrath kind of be this bridge card in the domain decks where it gets you from the early game of ramping into the late game of your finishers. I could see a copy of 2 of Roxanne doing something similar. It loses lifelink, which is annoying against aggro, but it makes up for that in some sense by also ramping you with a meteor. So I could see, like, you turn 3 your Topiary Stomper, that ramps you up to 5. On turn 4 you Roxanne, you snipe one of your opponent's things, you get the meteor, and then the next turn the meteor is going to give you the mana to Atraxa or Atali or whatever you're trying to do, whatever your big finisher is. So I can definitely see uses for this card there. In Commander, really good with like doubling season effects. Anything to give you more meteorites is going to make Roxanne even better. So many of the typical token synergies, there's even some combo potential. Like if you go infinite with Food Chain to make infinite mana, like you can sacrifice Squee a bunch of times to make infinite mana, just keep casting it from exile, or Eternal Scourge, keep exiling it to make a bunch of mana. So you make infinite mana with Food Chain, and then once you have infinite mana and you have like 200 mana floating from your Food Chain loop, then you can play Roxanne from the command zone, ping someone with the meteorite, exile it to Food Chain, play it again with your infinite mana, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. It is worth mentioning, I saw some people confused about this. Roxanne itself doesn't go infinite with Food Chain. Roxanne just makes a meteorite, so it's always going to cost too much mana to be able to keep looping it. But so you have to go infinite with like the Squee or the Eternal Scourge, but then Roxanne would be a good finisher once you go infinite with Food Chain. There's also possibilities of like looping it with Deadeye Navigator. It works really well with Amulet of Vigor to make the meteorites come into play untapped rather than tapped. When your meteorites are coming to play untapped, you could like Deadeye Navigator your Roxanne, you could blink it to get a meteorite, which will make 2 mana because of Roxanne, and be untapped because of Amulet of Vigor, and then you can do it again and do it again, which will give you infinite damage essentially from the meteorites entering the battlefield. Color combination's a little weird. You can't play Deadeye Navigator if Roxanne's your actual commander, but if you can find a way to make all this work together, there is combo potential. So Roxanne, I like this card. It's just like a really fun, cute card. Putting a meteorite on the battlefield is interesting. I'm actually curious, and I haven't seen confirmation of this, and I assume the answer to this is no, but I'm curious if the meteorite has a mana value. I believe that it shouldn't, and it's going to be like a no mana value token copy of meteorite, but we have seen tokens that are copies of things that have mana values in the past, so maybe it'll work that way. If it does have mana value, that could open up some other possibilities, like Metalwork Colossus cares about mana value of non-creature artifacts. Even like Karn Legacies Reforged in Standard wants these high value non-creature artifacts on the battlefield. So we'll have to wait and see, but overall, Roxanne, it seems like a really fun card to build around. We also got a new Marchesa in Marchesa Dealer of Death. So Marchesa, 3 mana Grixis 3/4, legendary human rogue. It says whenever you commit a crime, you can pay 1. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand and the other in the graveyard. Notable here that this is one of the only crime cards we've seen, payoffs we've seen for criming, that don't have the once per turn restriction. Of course, there is another restriction. You got to pay a mana each time. So it's gonna be a safety valve, make it difficult to go infinite with, but still, you can potentially commit multiple crimes in a turn, pay 1 for each of them, and draw a bunch of cards, fill your graveyard at lightning speed. So essentially what Marchesa does is whenever you commit a crime, you can pay 1 to Nagging Thoughts, and Nagging Thoughts isn't like a busted card, but it's generating card advantage, and it's filling your graveyard, which can be pretty relevant in formats that have Delve, or you're reanimating things. Like getting cards in the graveyard is often an upside, so I think this is a relatively powerful effect. In some ways, it reminds me of Corpse Appraiser. We already have this Grixis 3-drop in the format that generates card advantage. The upside of Corpse Appraiser is it just does its thing right away, right? It comes into play, you're going to be able to draw a card, you're going to get 2 cards in your graveyard, it's going to do that immediately, doesn't matter if your opponent has interaction or removal. Marchesa, on the other hand, doesn't do anything when it comes into play. The upside of Marchesa, though, is it's repeatable, so if Marchesa sticks around, this can be generating a ton of card advantage each and every turn, so I think that Marchesa is kind of fighting for a similar role. It's really going to depend on how easy is it for you to crime in your deck. If you're playing a deck that's based around criming consistently, then I think Marchesa goes way up in value. We got cards like Tiny Bones Joins Up, which just commits a crime whenever a legend ETBs. If you're playing something like that, then Marchesa goes way up in value, right? If you're drawing 2 cards with this each turn, or 3 cards with this each turn, as your Tiny Bones joining up and cutting down and duressing your opponent, then Marchesa can just snowball card advantage into a victory. And also, the way crime works is you're targeting your opponent's stuff, right? So Marchesa kind of incentivizes you to like rip apart your opponent's hand with discard, to kill all their creatures, and as you're doing that, it's rewarding you with card advantage, which is going to give you more discard, going to give you more removal, to just keep that snowball going. So I actually think Marchesa has some potential. In Commander, there's also a infinite crime combo in Eater of the Dead. Eater of the Dead is a card to keep in mind, because this card is one of the best ways to just commit a ton of crime. So Eater of the Dead's ability, it's a 5-mana 3/4 from the dark. It says, pay 0, take 1 creature from any graveyard, remove it from the game, untap Eater of the Dead. Its Oracle text, though, is a little bit different. Its Oracle text is, pay 0, if it's tapped, exile target creature card from a graveyard and untap Eater of the Dead. So the trick here is, if you get your Eater of the Dead tapped, attack with it, whatever, saddle it, crew it, but if you get it tapped, you can activate its ability, targeting whatever creature's in the graveyard, and then in response to the first activation, you can activate it again, and again, and again, and you can do this as many times as you want. You could activate it a million times if you wanted to, and technically, each time you activate it, you're going to be committing a crime, because you're targeting a card in your opponent's graveyard. You do have to activate in response, because once it becomes untapped, its ability is not going to work anymore. So you could have your Marchesa out, have your Eater of the Dead, and just pay like 0 100 times to put 100 crime triggers on the stack, and then you just pay 1 for as many as you can and draw that many cards. So keep that in mind. There are some ways in Magic that you can actually go on an infinite crime spree of all things. So Marchesa, I like the card. It's nothing special, but it's a nice little value engine. I like that it fills a graveyard, it generates card advantage. So if you're going to be doing some criming and you're in the Grixis colors, it's definitely worth keeping in mind at least. We also got another Joins Up enchantment. This one is Kellan Joins Up. So Kellan Joins Up, a 3-mana Bant legendary enchantment. It says when it enters the battlefield, you can exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand. If you do, it becomes plotted. If that sounds familiar, it's essentially the same ability as New Jace's second +1 ability. And then whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So Kellan Joins Up. This card is probably actually busted. So I realized recently that Jace Reawaken might be way scarier than I thought yesterday because of that second +1. So if we read these abilities carefully, you may exile a non-land card with mana value 3 or less from your hand. If you do, it becomes plotted. So what this means is Kellan Joins Up, or also Jace, can use that ability to exile something like Velki, God of Lies, from your hand, because Velki has mana value 3 or less. But then once Velki becomes plotted, you can cast either side of it. So you can use this trick to cast a Tibalt Cosmic Imposter and get this 7-mana Planeswalker for 3 mana essentially, and waiting 1 turn with Kellan Joins Up, or 2 mana and waiting some amount of turns with Jace Reawaken, which is a really, really scary thing. We have seen in the past, not that long ago, that cascading into Velki and casting Tibalt was so incredibly broken that it actually made Wizards change the rules of Magic to keep that from happening. This isn't quite as good, right? The difference with Kellan Joins Up compared to like a 3-mana cascade spell is there is that suspend 1. You got to cast the Kellan Joins Up, you got to wait 1 turn, and then you can cast the Tibalt. So that suspend 1 does slow it down a little bit, but still it seems pretty easy in Modern to build a deck where on turn 1 you play a Mana Dork, on turn 2 you Kellan Joins Up and you plot the Velki, and then on turn 3 you play the 7-mana Planeswalker Tibalt and probably just win the game on the spot. Also can do a trick with this in Standard with some adventure stuff. stuff like Bramble Familiar is a 2-drop, so it works with Kellan Joins Up. We can plot it, but then we can choose to cast this 7-mana fetch quest mode to go digging for some massive creature that we're going to reanimate. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. I could definitely see that being a thing in Standard, where you're like, turn 3, the Kellan Joins Up, exile the Bramble Familiar, turn 4, cast fetch quest, and try to hit a Troxa or a Tally or something and win the game. So I think this plot a mana value 3 or less card from your hand ability is actually way scarier than I thought. When I first read it, I was thinking, okay, like, it kind of gives you like a free spell the next turn, right? You play 3 mana for the enchantment, you can exile something, mana value 3 or less, cast it the next turn. So it's a nice little value-y mechanic, but when you think about the most extreme uses of this and what it does with some of these weird like flip cards and double face cards, it actually can do some pretty busted thing. The second mode of Kellan Joins Up is essentially Cathar's Crusade, but for legendary creatures, which is honestly a really powerful, but also super annoying effect. If you've never played with Cathar's Crusade before, it is an absolute nightmare to track, because the ability is just whenever a creature you TBs under your control, you put a +1/+1 on each creature you control. So what this means is, you're gonna have a big board full of creatures, presumably in a game of Commander, and every time you cast a creature, you're gonna have to add a counter to everything, but that means like creatures that have been around for a while are gonna have a ton of counters, newer creatures have less counters. It's kind of just like, I don't even know, being an accountant or something. It's not even playing Magic. It's just like trying to math out all these counters for no real purpose. So Kellan Joins Up is certainly really powerful. If you're playing a lot of Legends, this is Cathar's Crusade, a really, really strong card. But for 3 mana instead of 5 mana, I would just warn you, if you don't like playing with a lot of dice and having to track a lot of things, keep that in mind before you put this in your deck, because I think you're going to find that if you're playing a legendary theme deck, which is where you'd want this, like a Joda deck or Radadrobic deck or whatever, it's probably going to get pretty annoying pretty fast. In Standard, though, if you're playing on Arena, it definitely doesn't matter, and we have more than enough Legends to make a deck that is all Legends and really power this card up. And I would play it in Commander decks too, I think. Like I said, the tracking issue is there, but it seems like a really strong card if you're built around a deck full of legendary creatures, like a Sisay deck or a Joda deck or whatever. So Kellan Joins Up, I think this card might just actually be broken. I think that cheating a Valky into play, cheating a Bramble Familiar fetch quest into play, some of the tricks that you can do by plotting these cards actually makes me really scared. So I would not be at all surprised if this actually has a modern deck built around it, probably has a standard deck built around it, and that doesn't even include all the Cathar's Crusade drawing your Legends mode. So this card, I think, is actually kind of busted, and I'm actually curious if WotC knew about this trick. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe WotC will make some rules change, or when we get the full rules, maybe there'll be some announcement that like, hey, you can't actually cast, you know, the Tibalt side if you do this. We'll have to wait and see, but for now, I think the synergies this offers makes it one of the strongest cards we've seen in the set so far. We also got a new Riku in Riku of Many Paths. So Riku of Many Paths, 3-mana teamer, 3/3 legendary human wizard, and it says whenever you cast a modal spell, choose up to X, where X is the number of times you chose a mode for that spell. Exile the top card of your library, you can play it until the end of your next turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Riku, and it gets trample until end of turn, or make a 1/1 blue bird creature token. I gotta say, I don't know if this card's very powerful. I actually think for 60 card formats, it's probably not very powerful at all, but it is one of the coolest designs from the set. I don't think we've ever had a modal matters commander. This is caring about something that the game has just never cared about before. So if you're wondering what a modal spell is, it's essentially just anything that says choose one. So like charms, for example, like Teamer Charm. Choose one of these 3 options. All the new spree cards work really well with Riku, because Riku, remember, doesn't just care about you casting a modal spell. It cares about how many modes on that spell you choose. So if you cast a Teamer Charm, you're going to get one of Riku's abilities. If you cast, let's say, a Cryptic Command, which is choose 2 of 4 options, you're going to get 2 of Riku's abilities. If you choose a Final Showdown or cast a Collective Defiance and you choose all the modes, you're actually going to be able to get all of Riku's abilities. And when you're casting a spell that you already wanted to cast, like you already wanted to cast a Collective Defiance, cards, and you're also drawing a card or impulse drawing a card, growing your Riku, and making a bird, that's actually a pretty powerful effect. So these are the kind of cards you're looking for. Basically, look for anything that says choose one, choose any number, choose two, anything like that's going to be really good with Riku. I did want to mention, it does say spells in specific. So you might be thinking, oh, like Hullbreaker or Ertha, they are modal cards. They have choose one abilities. However, once they're on the battlefield, they're no longer spells. So they're not modal spells, they're like modal permanents. So a Hullbreaker, not going to trigger your Riku. In Ertha, it's ETB trigger, even though it's modal, not going to trigger your Riku. So keep that in mind. It's got to be things that are choose one on the stack, essentially. Some of the best options for this are going to just be these modal spells have a bunch of options, like Mystic Confluence, Fiery Confluence, Sublime Epiphany. Anything that gives you 3 or more choices is going to max out your Riku every time. So I think that Riku, I don't think it's busted. I don't think it's even especially strong. It just seems super fun. If you like the idea of building like a charm commander deck or a modal spell commander deck, this is a really sweet way to do it. And I love commanders. They have you play cards you wouldn't play in most decks. And, you know, I don't see Fiery Confluence or Mystic Confluence or Sublime Epiphany or Temur Charm, cards like that. You just don't see them very often. And those are going to be some of the strongest cards in a Riku of many past decks. So Riku, I would be absolutely shocked if this was a super playable standard card. We could definitely build like an against odds deck around it or something, but I would be very surprised. It's just too slow, right? You got to play this, you need to wait to untap so you can have mana to cast modal spells, you need to cast specific spells, and then your reward is good, but it's not like game-endingly good. So I'd be very surprised if this was a card for 60 card formats, but I do think it's going to be one of the more popular build around commanders from the set, just because it offers something new. It's something unique that we haven't seen before. We also got one notable reprint today in Archangel of Tithes. So I have no idea why Archangel of Tithes fits Outlaws at Thunder Junction. It doesn't really scream Old West to me in any way, so I don't know how they ended on Archangel of Tithes being the mythic reprint, but the card itself is a good reprint. So Archangel of Tithes, if you don't know this one, it's a 4 mana 3/5. It's got triple weight in the mana cost for a flyer that says, as long as it's untapped, creatures can't attack you or planeswalkers you control unless they pay 1 for each of those creatures, and as long as it's attacking, creatures can't block unless their controller pays 1 for each of their blocking creatures. So Archangel of Tithes, actually a pretty powerful card. It did see play last time it was in Standard, which was admittedly like a decade ago, so we'll have to see how it lines up today, but I actually think it has a chance. Worst case, it's like a $20 reprint, so it's a good card to get out there for Commander or whatever, just get more copies in the market. So this is a card that was originally printed in Magic Origins, never really been reprinted. It was on the list for a while, but this is the first full reprinting of Archangel of Tithes, and the reason I'm kind of hyped about this card for Standard is the mini Ghostly Prison effect. The having to pay 1 to attack you for each creature actually is really relevant in specific decks. So we have Angel support in Standard. We got Giada still. We got Archangel of Wrath. So this could easily slot into an Angel deck or some sort of mono white deck. And it seems especially well suited at slowing down the Boros deck. The Boros deck, one of the scariest decks in Standard. It can just put so many bodies on the battlefield so quickly that it's really easy for that deck to just overwhelm you if you don't have a Wrath or something. Archangel of Tithes seems like a really sneaky good answer to this. Your opponent's gonna have all these like 1/1s on the battlefield. You play the Archangel of Tithes, they can't just swarm you and attack with 10 creatures and play their Imodane Recruiter and kill you Goblin Bushwhacker style. So I think that Archangel of Tithes, yes, it can die to removal, but as long as it's sitting on the battlefield, it's gonna make it really, really tough for the Boros deck to actually kill you. Plus, it can do some damage on offense as well. We've seen this be like the top end of aggro decks before, where it makes it hard for your opponent to block their stuff because they need a mana for each blocker. So I think that Archangel of Tithes actually could be relevant for Standard. The other place that this card will see play is specifically in mono white Angel Commander decks. If you look on like EDH Rec, you can see what decks actually play a card, and Archangel of Tithes, it shows up about half the time in Giada, in Lyra, Bruna, Gazella, Avacyn. Once you get to multicolor Angel decks, you usually don't play it, in part because of its triple white mana cost, and in part because once you're 2 colors or 3 colors, you just have more options, so you don't really need Archangel of Tithes. But if you're a mono white Angel deck in Commander, this should drop the price of Archangel of Tithes quite a bit, because its current price of like $20 is mostly because it's just never really been reprinted, not because it sees a huge amount of play. So this should get the cost down. So if you're looking for a sneaky upgrade for Giada or Lyra or something, this will be your chance to get an Archangel of Tithes on the cheap. In the world of lower rarity cards, we actually got a lower rarity legend that's pretty interesting, an Ertha Frontier Mentor. So it's a 4-mana Boros 2/4. It's a core advisor. It's legendary. When it ETBs, it makes a 1/1 mercenary that can tap to pump something only as a sorcery, blah, 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 blah. We've seen that before. The interesting part is whenever you activate an ability that targets a creature or player, you copy that ability and you can choose new targets for the copy. So this is kind of like a weird Panharmonicon effect. It doesn't have a once per turn restriction or anything, and it just seems really fun. Normally when it comes to Boros commanders, it's like, hey, I'm aggro, hey, I'm equipment. Those are like the two things that almost every Boros commander seems to be. Ertha actually doing something different, caring about like targeting stuff and abilities, and it does have infinite combo potential, and I'm sure there's like way more infinite combos, but if you can have something like Palladium Mirror to go along with Voltaic Key, you just go infinite. You can tap Palladium Mirror to make 2 mana. Then you can Voltaic Key to target the Palladium Mirror to untap it. That'll trigger Ertha, so you can copy Voltaic Key's ability. You can use the copy to untap itself. So essentially your Palladium Mirror taps for 2, untaps for 1, taps for 2, untaps for 1. Keep in mind though, Ertha only works with creatures or players. So for this combo to work, you specifically need an artifact creature that taps for at least 2 mana. So I think Ertha actually going to be one of the more popular uncommon commanders, because it just seems fun to build around and you get these janky infinite combos. We also got Lively Dirge, another one of the spree cards. So this one is 1 in a black, and then spree is +1 generic, search your library for a card, put it in your graveyard and shuffle, or +2 generic, return up to 2 creature cards with total mana value of 4 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This one I want to mention just because it's like a bad Entomb, but if you're a deck that is trying to reanimate stuff, especially in like Commander, maybe in some 60 card formats, but if you just really need to get that specific thing in your graveyard so you can combo off or reanimate it, Lively Dirge gets it done. It's obviously way more expensive than Entomb. Entomb is as good as this gets. It's 1 mana instant speed. This is 3 mana sorcery speed, but still it's worth keeping in mind. And then you also get this like weird Call the Death Dweller style effect where for 4 mana, you can reanimate up to 4 mana value worth of creatures, and it could be up to 2 creatures. So I don't think this card's like busted or anything, but I could see uses for it, especially since Entomb is just not legal in a lot of formats. So if you're trying to like Entomb in Standard, let's say, or Entomb in Pioneer, this might actually just be the best option to get that specific card in your graveyard. We also got the best mono white commander card from the set so far in Arid Archway. So Arid Archway, it's a desert, ETBs taps in 2 colorless mana, and when it ETBs, you return a land you control to your hand. If it was another desert, you get to surveil 1, whatever, we don't care about that. This is just another bounce land, and bounce lands are some of the most important cards in mono white commander decks, because the easiest and best way to ramp in mono white, and ramp is like the best thing you can do in commander alongside drawing cards, but the best way to ramp in mono white is catch-up ramp. Things like Knight of the White Orchid, Loyal Warhound, that requires you to have less lands than your opponent. So bounce lands are a really easy way that you can develop mirror mana every turn, not miss any land drops, and turn on all your ramp spells. So I feel like Arid Archway is just like a staple in mono white decks. Right now we have Guildless Commons, we have Karoo, which is kind of the worst of the bunch because you have to return on untapped plains, which is a big ask. But you have Guildless Commons, you got Karoo, which is pretty sketchy, you got Lotus Field, which isn't technically a bounce land but kind of serves the same purpose, and now Arid Archway. So if you're playing a mono white commander deck that's built around catch-up ramp, I think you just play this card 100% of the time. I think white still could use more of these. I don't know where the cutoff is for how many bounce lands I actually want in mono white, but we haven't reached it yet. So Arid Archway, if you're playing mono white, trying to do the catch-up ramp thing, put it in your deck every time. It's going to be really, really good. Otherwise, we get a bunch of filler stuff, a bunch of draft chaff stuff. Some of it's pretty interesting, though. We get, like, Cunning Coyote, which is obviously a Roadrunner and Coyote reference from Looney Tunes. Intimidation Campaign, so close to Disinformation Campaign. When it ETBs, each opponent loses a life, you gain a life and draw a card. When you commit a crime, you bounce it back to your hand. It's exactly Disinformation Campaign, except Disinformation Campaign made your opponent discard a card. So it's missing one pretty important piece of the Disinformation Campaign puzzle, but still maybe could see some uses in some sort of crime deck. But anyway, you can see all this stuff over at MTGpreviews.com. And anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers for today. So what's your favorite card of the day? Anyway, what's your hype level for this set? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with even more Outlaws of Thunder Junction spoilers. So until then, have a spectacular day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video right here, or maybe check out the Matcha Brew, where we did some conspiracy unraveling in Standard.